Okay. Anybody need the handout? Matthew chapter 10. I know I have mentioned this story, but I don't think we've ever gone over this passage. Does anybody recall it? Okay. I'm going to take these verses from Matthew 10, 29 through 31, but listen to some verses earlier in Matthew 10. Jesus is speaking to his 12 disciples, and he says, "Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves." Oh boy, they're probably going to start worrying. They know they've got hard things ahead of them. "Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, but beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues. You shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them to the Gentiles. But whenever they deliver you up, take no thought of how or what you shall speak. It will be given to you in that hour. It is not you that speaks, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Brother shall deliver up brother to death, and father the child, and the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. You shall be hated of all men for my sake." So the Lord, He is sending them as sheep in the midst of wolves. Now, the disciples were common, ordinary people. No doubt they started being full of anxiety when Jesus said this. Now, look at what he's going to go on to say now in 10:29. Now, we have we have a question in verse 29. "Are sparrows not sold too for a penny?" Now, that's a figure of speech called eroticus of affirmation. You say something in a question that requires a positive answer in order to emphasize it. So let me remove the question. Sparrows are sold 2 for a penny. Now, if a little sparrow sold 2 for a penny, how expensive are they? No. We would say they're a dime a dozen. So these little birds must be very insignificant. They are to you and me. They're not to their Creator. And that's why the first 2 words in the second line of verse 29 are "and yet." That means in spite of the fact that these little birds are so cheap, so unimportant to you and me. That's not the way it is with God. And yet not one of them will fall to the ground. Now, what he means, he doesn't mean fall to the ground in the sense that here comes a bird, he's coming in for a landing on this limb, but he misses the limb and falls to the ground. And he's not talking about a bird sitting on a fence. He doesn't mean to fall asleep, but he dozes off to sleep, loses his grip, and falls to the ground. What he means by falling to the ground is he dies and falls to the ground. Yet not one of them will die without your Father's consent. Now, how does this apply to you and me? He's talking about birds. Well, he's going to make the transition now in verse 30. "But even the hairs of your head." Now, you'll notice on my translation in the first line of verse 30, I underlined the word "your." And I did that on purpose. I want you to look at the Greek text of verse 30. The very first word, humon, that means your. It is the first word in verse 30 of the Greek text when it ought to be the last word in the first line. So by putting it where it doesn't belong, Matthew, the writer, is putting great stress on your. Even the hairs of your head. Now what he means is maybe God doesn't count the hairs on the heads of non-Christians, but you're different. You are the children of God. You are precious to God. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Now, did you ever think about that? Numbered? That's not to be taken literally. And I think God knows how many hairs on your head. And by the way, about how many hairs are on your head? Well, experts tell us Now, except for Rashid over here, and except for Dave Eccles back there, the typical person has 600,000 hairs on his head. 600,000. And so when he says the hairs of your head are all numbered, that is a figure of speech called metonymy. Metonymy means one word, numbered, is put in place of another word, protected. See, what good would it do you if I said, now, after prayer meeting, I want you to stay behind. Let everybody else go, but I want you to have a seat here, and I'm going to take the next 3 hours, and I'm going to count I'm going to count every hair on your head. Now, it'll take me 3 hours, but I'll do it. Now, and let's suppose that after 3 hours, I knew exactly how many hairs she's got on her head. 6,321. What good would that do you if I knew exactly how many hairs are on your head? It wouldn't do you any good. So what good does it do you and me if God knows exactly how many hairs I've got on my head? But he doesn't mean God just counts the numbers of our hair. What he means is God protects every single unimportant hair on our head. Now, why does he do that? You are so precious to the Almighty that every hair on your head is precious to him. Now, there's not a person here that wouldn't hesitate to reach up, grab a bunch of hairs, and jerk them out and let them drop to the floor. Why? Well, because the hairs on our head are not that important, and we know if we pull some out, they're just going to grow back. So while the hairs on our head are not that important to us, they're very important to God. So important, he counts he protects every hair on our head. We have a similar expression of that in English, where it says, maybe you might tell somebody, don't let a hair on the head of my child get hurt. You tell your babysitter, I'm hiring you to take care of my baby boy today. Don't let a hair on his head get hurt. That means no harm whatsoever is to come to my child. Now, verse 31 spells out the point to you and me. So stop fearing. Now, this is what's called a prohibitive imperative in Greek. It means action that is already in progress is to immediately stop. What action's in progress? The disciples, and you can't blame them when Jesus says they're worrying. They're full of anxiety. You can't blame them. What did Jesus say? I'm sending you guys out to preach in the midst of wolves, and you're going to be beat, and you may be betrayed by people in your family that are closest to you. You got a lot of trouble coming. And so now you're saying, stop fearing. You are worth more than many sparrows. Now you'll notice in my translation of verse 31, last line, first word, you is underlined. In the Greek text, it is doubly emphatic. You, my disciples, you, the children of God. Now, most of us here are parents. Well, I'm asking you as parents and grandparents, are your children important, precious to you? Of course they are. And why are our children precious to us? They're our treasure. We're made in the image of God. He's like that toward you and me. So the Lord, while God is concerned about mere, cheap, inexpensive little birds, He's far more concerned for you and me. That's why Jesus says, you disciples are worth more than many birds. Now, I've mentioned this before, but let me do it again. I think it was my first year teaching at Moody. My classes are over with. It's about 4 p.m. I'm in my office, just catching my breath after all the busyness of the day. Phone rings. It's Dan Dion, next door neighbor. And he says, you must drop whatever you're doing and get home as fast as you can. Your wife has just fallen out of your attic backwards, head first, 10 feet. She landed on solid concrete. She's unable to speak, unable to move, and an ambulance has whisked her off to a nearby emergency room of a hospital. Now, the only way I had to get home was a slow commuter train, and it took an hour to get there. And the man who called me said, I'll be there and pick you up. And so I had an hour on my hand before I got home. Now, what do you do with that hour on your hand? I began to pray for Sue. I began to prepare myself for what I might find when I got to the hospital. Now, a few years before that, Sue and I had a friend, a professional construction worker. He fell 10 feet and landed on his head. It immediately killed him. So I didn't know when I got to the hospital room if I was going to find a dead wife, a severely, permanently paralyzed wife, or a wife with just minor injuries. And so I began to pray for Sue and prepare myself for what I might find. As I'm doing that, it must have been God's Holy Spirit who brought this passage to mind, and one word caught my attention, and that is the word in verse 29, second line, and yet not one of them will fall to the ground. Now, I begin to reason biblically, which means I begin to reason correctly. If a mere bird cannot fall to the ground without heaven's consent, how much more is that true of my wife? She's worth more than many birds. Sue fell. God let her fall. Now, I drew a conclusion. Therefore, she will not be injured any further than what God allows. Now, if I get there to the hospital and find out she's dead, that's not what I want. I will trust God with that. He made that decision. If she's badly, permanently injured, that's not what I want. I will trust God with that. He's got his reasons for it. And when I got to the hospital, I was just so grateful we got off light. Sue received a terrible gash in her scalp that required 18 stitches, I think, to close it. They let me take her home about 2 o'clock in the morning and said, but now you can let her sleep, but you have to wake her up so many hours so she doesn't lapse into a coma. Next day she couldn't get up, but the day after that she could get up, but she was real weak and feeble walking around. Now, from her perspective, and correct me now anywhere along the line if I'm wrong, I'm remembering the way back, she told me that when she lost her grip and started falling, she said she knew she was in trouble. That's an easy conclusion to reach. And all the way down, she had peace. And when she hit the cement on her head first, she said the blow was so great she couldn't even feel it. And she could hear the children around her talking to her, three small children talking to her. Okay, what?
I bounced twice and I saw clouds coming out.
Okay.
And then my jaw was knocked down in place.
Okay.
And so I had to talk through clenched teeth.
Okay, well, I didn't know all that. I didn't know she bounced twice. Okay. And so Sue said she knew she was injured, but she said she knew she said she was still full of peace. She just knew whatever the injury, she was in the hand of God. And so the Lord really spared us. So look at some applications on the back. Number one, it is our responsibility to do everything possible to ensure our safety. Part of God's provision for our safety is using what he put between our ears. We do everything we can to keep ourselves safe. So before you cross this busy Pulaski Avenue out here, look to the left and look to the right, and then cross the street. We don't go to the curb saying, well, okay, God's going to keep me safe, so I'm going to shut my eyes and walk blindfolded across that. No, I'm not going to court death and act foolish. Number two, most of the responsibility for our safety, fortunately for us, lies on God's shoulders. There are times when you do everything you can to keep yourself safe, and that's not enough. God steps in. If he doesn't want you dead, or doesn't want you hurt, and he delivers you. Oh, sometimes, folks, I think about going to Vietnam and the times I could have been killed, or Dave Eccles. It's just enormous. And sometimes now when I think about it, now it scares me. All the dangers over there. And I don't doubt that God kept me safe over there. Dave, do you doubt that? That God kept you safe over there?
Sure did.
Yeah, that's right. We wouldn't be here without the Lord. Number 3, we are indestructible till our work on earth is finished. When our task is done, we have no more reason to be here. So the very fact that you are alive and breathing means God still has service work for you to do. Otherwise, He wouldn't leave you here. Now, I had a student at Moody named Joey Ganley. She's from Akron, Ohio. And she was going home on Christmas break on the Illinois-Indiana tollway, and an 18-wheel diesel ran over her car and crushed it. And she got up and walked out of it. And the state policeman who investigated it said, I just can't believe this. That you look at your car, it's flat as a pancake, and you don't have a scratch on you. Well, Joy, God had work for her to do. It was in Uzbekistan as a missionary. And He didn't want her dead, so He spared her. Now, I had a student at Moody from Texas named Jason, and Jason told me, now this was about the same time Joey Ganley got run over. My brother, with his fiancée in his front seat of his car, pulled his car out onto a highway, and they got run over by an 18-wheel diesel, and both of them crushed to death. Now, Jason says, he said, this is my interpretation of it. God took my brother's life because he had such a bad attitude to Dad and Mom. He was very rebellious. We had talked to him about his attitude. God had tried to get his attention about it, and he wouldn't listen. And I said, I just think the Lord knew the best thing to do before things got worse in my brother's life was to take him home prematurely. So you and I are indestructible until our work on earth is finished. Number 4, if it's true that God protects every hair on our head, then we need not fear for our safety. Now, just for a moment, let's assume that what Jesus said is true. It probably is. I think it is. You think it is. Okay, it's true. Now, do you really have anything to worry about when it comes to your personal safety? We're going to breathe as long as God wants us to. James 4, if the Lord will, then we shall live and do this or that. Okay, any questions or comments over these verses? Anybody?
I believe it was Erwin Lutzer who had a couple of remarks to say about this, and they just stay with me. He knows the number of hairs on your head for me, for you, the believer.
Yeah.
So that talks of His meticulous care of us.
Isn't that amazing?
And then secondly, think of this. When you comb your hair, brush your hair, wash your hair, hairs fall out.
Yeah.
When you sleep, your hair grows. So there's more in the morning than there was when you went to bed. So that number, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is always changing. Yet God cares for you so very much that even though it's always changing, He still knows the number.
Yeah.
That's how close and how interpersonal God's care is for the individual.
Yeah, that's
believer.
good. That's good. That's good. That was well that stayed with you.
Yeah.
I still think with Rashad, now the Lord doesn't have much trouble keeping up with the number of hairs on his head. We're just kidding you.
No, he's got stubble.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions or comments on this passage? Yes.
I was just going to say that these applications are very true in like these times that we're witnessing all these things happening, and sometimes probably Satan or our friends and family around us always trying to instill fear inside us.
Yeah.
And this is a good way to remind ourselves.
Yeah.
Don't tap into that. and
Yeah.
just believe.
That's right. That's good. That's good. Yep. Sue?
Mary had a good comment before everything started, she was reading over this. Do you want to say anything about that, Mary? How does this apply with
Well, first of all, I'd like to know how many of those are Christians. I imagine the majority of the Israelis who are in danger today are blind to Christ. And in their case, I would say Jesus is trying to get their attention. Hey, I'm here. Come to me. I can help out. For believers who are exposed to that danger, well, it's just like Dave Eccles going to war. See, if God wants them to survive, they will. If He doesn't, well, they can be in a safe place in bed at night, and they're not going to wake up in the morning.
Okay, so God protects every hair and brings us home to heaven, even though we might go through some terrible, terrible things.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Say that again louder, Sue. Say it again louder, please.
Can you repeat it?
No, I can't.
So God protects our hairs, even though we might go through some terrible things. He's
Oh
there
yeah.
with us.
Oh yeah, God protects us. Yeah. Yep. Anything else? Okay, it's time to pray. And I don't know where my handheld microphone is. Does anybody know where that is?
I think